Praise be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.
Today's readings have as their main theme the coming of the forerunner, the coming of John the Baptist, the one who prepared the Lord's way for his ministry. So it's an appropriate theme for the last day or second to last day of Advent as we prepare for Christ's coming at Christmas. Secondary theme that we see in the first reading is the idea of purification. That when the Messiah comes, one of his main missions will be to purify God's people, beginning with the religious leaders, identified as the sons of Levi in Malachi 3, verse 3. The Levites were the clerical tribe of Israel. They were entrusted with all the matters related to worship and to religious instruction, and they had become neglectful and sinful. Just as politics is downstream from culture, so too the spiritual state of God's people is usually downstream from his priests. If the priests, who are God's mediators, as go-betweens between him and the people, if God's priests are sinful and sacrilegious and self-centered and worldly, don't expect much more from the flock, right? Don't expect much better. The priests are responsible for the religious decline of the people, so purification has to start with them. So the Lord promises in the first reading that the Messiah will purify his priests, and then through them he will also purify his people. And why does God purify them or purify us? He says in Malachi 3:3, so that the priests, and we can also add the faithful as well, can bring offerings to the Lord in righteousness. The offering of righteousness that God's priests bring to him in this period of the church now is what? It's the Holy Eucharist, actually. The offering of righteousness of the people is their life offered in union with the Holy Eucharist. So why does God purify us? So that our worship will be perfected. The worship of God is not only what gives meaning to life, but in the next life it will be our unending glory, our unending joy. So if Sunday is not a day of worship or a day of rest for you, if Sunday is just like every other day of the week, then actually, believe it or not, none of the days of the week have any meaning. Why? Because life becomes meaningless when the author of life is not given his due, essentially. Conversion is a process of purification. The Lord works to purify us first from all mortal sin, so from serious sin. That includes removing occasions of sin from us, also teaching us how to avoid occasions of sin, persons, places, things that easily lead us into serious sin. Sometimes watching the news leads us into serious, or gets us really angry at least, right? And the Lord also works to purify us of deliberate venial sin, so all those small sins which we willfully choose to do. It's like the Lord basically cuts down, first thing he does is he cuts down the big weeds, and so we look around and say, wow, no more weeds in my life. This is wonderful. But the roots are still there. That's the problem. 7 vices, so pride, anger, envy, sloth, lust, gluttony, greed, or covetousness. Those vices, what do? They go dormant for a while after we've had a big conversion and have begun to live a faithful Catholic life. But they return later. Why? Because the roots aren't gone. They're still there. They return, and when they return, the Lord wants us to know that he literally wants to get to the root of the problem here. He wants to have a deeper purification of our souls. As he takes away our consolations and our good feelings about doing spiritual things, the Lord helps us to see better those roots that still need to be weeded out. So as the feelings or sense of enjoyment or pleasure in serving him, or maybe even praying in him, as those things go away, we're actually given a greater self-knowledge, a deeper knowledge of our misery, of our need for God, of his grace, a more keen knowledge of our need for further purification. Also, the depriving of consolations and good feelings is meant to help us, one, not to trust too much in ourselves, because we see many of our miseries are still within us, so I don't want to trust too much in myself. It's also meant to purify our love. It's meant to teach us humility and detachment, so detachment from pleasures and comforts and even detachment from our own wills. It forces us to either turn to the Lord turn to Him and for help and to cling to Him, or we just turn away from Him spiritually. Just throwing ourselves back into worldly pleasures or distractions or comforts. It forces us to live a life of faith without feelings sometimes. So we don't want to live a life of feelings, we want to live a life of faith. Sometimes we're forced to do that by the Lord. St. Therese wrote the following to her sister Celine. She said, "What a grace when in the morning we feel no courage, no strength to practice virtue. That is the moment to put the axe to the root of the tree," she says. And what a profit at the end of the day. In one act of love, even unfelt love, all is repaired. So she calls living by faith without feelings, she calls that unfelt love. I'm loving even if I don't feel that I'm loving. Father Mark Foley, in his book, The Dark Night, talking about St. John of the Cross, he says that it's precisely at those moments when we're devoid of consolation and feeling desolate and disinclined to practice virtue that we are presented with the greatest opportunity to grow in virtue at those moments. This is because our love arises from the will alone, devoid of all effective support, what St. Therese calls unfelt love. I can actually choose to love and choose to do the right thing even when my feelings aren't with me. So it's a love that's rooted in action and in faith and in truth, not in feelings. The feelings come and go. It's good when they're here. Doesn't feel too good when they're not here, but I can't live based on those. Can't make our choices based on those. If we don't choose to live by faith when the good feelings are gone and the bad feelings and the crosses are upon us, if we choose to turn and embrace the comforts, distractions of the world again, it can almost be like people who turn to substance abuse problems, right? Alcohol, drugs, or have other addictions that they turn to. Why do they turn to those things? To anesthetize the pain, to help the pain go away, to feel differently. They want to feel better, so they turn to those things to alter their moods. Sometimes we too, spiritually, turn back to selfish indulgence and distractions in a similar dynamic. No, it's better to stay faithful instead. What did we hear in the first reading? We hear that the Lord of hosts is like the refiner's fire or like the fuller's lyre. He will sit refining and purifying silver. He will purify the sons of Levi, refining them like gold or silver, that they may offer due sacrifice to the Lord. Malachi 3, verses 2 and 3. Or as St. Paul would say, he says, "I'm confident that he who began a good work in you," meaning God who began your sanctification, your purification, "he will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ," says St. Paul, Philippians 1, verse 6. So we need to stay faithful, especially when we don't feel like it. This last part of our reflection, we'll say a few words about what we refer to in the spiritual life as the dark nights. The dark night of the senses, and later on, if we're still more advanced, the dark night of the soul. These things are called passive purifications. Why? Because it's not something you actively choose. You willingly choose to go through. Things that we actively choose would be like mortifications, penances, other forms of prayer, self-denial. We do with our own choice, our own will. The dark nights instead are what God does. A bit different. Of His own will. At least with our implicit consent, if not explicit consent. At least implicitly we're okay if He does that. Why does God bring us through dark nights? Because you can never purify yourself enough in your own strength and with your own choices, very simply. The work of purification, again, the work of sanctification, is God's work first and foremost. So He rolls up His sleeves and He begins scrubbing where He sees that it's needed. A lot of times there's a lot of scrubbing that's needed, right? A lot of purifying. In a word, how does the Lord purify us? With the cross. With the cross. Through the cross. Through the crosses that we meet up with each day. God tailors his crosses and his trials and purifications to each of us individually, depending on the degree of holiness to which we're called, also depending on our cooperation as well. So what does the cross look like in the dark night of the senses? The first one. For one, the soul undergoes a lot of dryness in prayer, so no real enjoyment praying. Can also experience terrible temptations against the faith. So because the person feels nothing, they feel no comfort from God. Sometimes they think that God's abandoned them, or their faith life is worthless. What's the point? It's all just in my imagination, right? They have trouble believing in the Lord sometimes. In the dark night of the senses, there can also be strong temptations against the virtue of hope. So if you don't have consolations, you, again, think you're abandoned by God. You're tempted to weariness or discouragement. There can be also temptations against chastity, too. St. John of the Cross says, "To some is sent the tool of Satan, the spirit of impurity, to buffet them with horrible and violent temptations of the flesh, to trouble their minds with filthy thoughts and their imaginations with representations of sin, most vividly depicted. At times it becomes an affliction more grievous than death," says St. John of the Cross. So why am I being tempted with all these impure thoughts? Sometimes it's the devil, sometimes it's the dark night. Also in the dark night of the senses, there can be temptations against the virtue of patience. Can be just tempted to complain about everything and everyone, right? Also blasphemous thoughts, too, can come to our imagination in a very vivid sense that we actually think we're saying them, even though we're not. There are obviously temptations against peace of soul, too, so you become obsessed maybe with 1,000 scruples and perplexities and so enmeshed in these ideas that you can't follow any advice, you can't even reason very well. So it's a very intense pain for some people as they go through it. In the dark night, you can also suffer from the actions of other people too, which might include persecutions, misunderstandings, other conflicts, physical ailments, losses in life, so losses of people, business, other losses as well. Inability to succeed, to operate like you did before, mental confusion too. They say it's like all of heaven and earth has conspired against you when you're going through this. That's kind of how you feel. St. John of the Cross says that this is actually all due to God infusing contemplation into your soul, of all things. And so it's so pure that the contemplation itself, that the soul can't really take it. It's like God doing an overhaul of our spiritual house, basically. Cleaning rooms, tearing down walls, removing, replacing appliances, plumbing, electrical wiring, all that stuff. He's doing all that. We don't know what's going on. What's happening to me? What's God doing? Well, he's making, as we say, the house into a home. A better home for him. A better home for us too, actually, believe it or not. It's all part of his conforming us to the image of his Son, as we read in Romans 8:29. In order for us to be more like Christ, there's a lot of remodeling, a lot of soul scrubbing that needs to be done inside of us. So we tend to think our problems in life have to do with what everyone else is doing wrong, right? Maybe I'm just the only one who thinks that, but what everyone else is doing wrong, that's the problem. The people around me, my family, co-workers, the lady at the checkout aisle, the guy who just cut in front of me on the street, problems in the government, problems in the church, you name it. The Lord says, no, he says the problem's you. You need to become more like me. That's the solution. That's why I'm doing this remodeling job. Let me get to work. And finally you realize that and you say, okay, well I guess the Lord is actually straightening out my soul, remodeling, cleaning up my soul. How do I pay him back for that? You have to pay someone who comes to fix your house, right? Typically it's not done for free. How do I pay the Lord back for that? By loving him. And by loving others too. Very simple. I like to quote St. Catherine of Siena. When Jesus said to her, he said, love of me and love of neighbor are one and the same thing. Since love of neighbor has its source in me, the more the soul loves me, the more she loves her neighbors. And he adds to her, every sin committed against me is done by means of your neighbor, because it deprives them of your loving charity, and it is charity that gives life to all virtue. So every time in my thoughts, my words, and what I have done, and what I have failed to do, as we say at the beginning of Mass, right? Every time I sin against or do good to others, I'm always doing it to Jesus, is what he's saying. That's my payback to him. So be careful about how you're giving him those house remodeling payments. Be careful about what you're paying back to him. Be very careful. And if you think of the dark night of the senses is tough, wait till you go through the dark night of the soul, right? So that's tough, okay. Dark night of the spirit, they call it, or the soul. St. John of the Cross says it's an even deeper purification. It's when God works to purify us even more of our disordered affections that we may still have, or a certain dullness of spirit, makes us easily subject to distractions from within, and maybe attractions from without. Plus, the dark night of the soul is God still having to purify us of a certain pride and maybe vanity, self-complacency that we have from the abundance of spiritual consolations that we've received. Those consolations can lead us to embracing illusions, making us think that we have true visions and prophecies that aren't really true, making us think that we're a lot holier than we really are. And the Lord also has to purify us of being overly bold towards him, which causes us to lose reverential fear of him that's meant to safeguard all virtue. So we can be bold to the Lord, but we also have to be respectful, right? He's a holy Father. He's a heavenly Father. He's holy, not just Father. He's also holy. So with a fatherly love, we go to him, but also remembering, reverential. He's in charge. In order to further purify and reform the soul in the dark night of the spirit, God leaves the mind in darkness, the will in aridity, the memory in forgetfulness, the affections immersed in pain and anguish. It's like a hell and purgatory put together is actually how they describe it. So you hear that and you say, boy, I hope that never happens to me, right? I hope that happens to someone else. Actually, no, you should, believe it or not, pray that it does happen to you. Why? Because it's actually a very beautiful, special gift when that happens. When God purifies your mind and your heart, your soul, it actually enables you to actually fully live those two great commandments. Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Luke 10:27. When you're purified, you'll be happier, more joyful, more blessed, and more better off for it now and for all eternity, actually. And last word, believe it or not, last thing I'm going to say. What's the actual attitude we should have when we go through purifications like this? Very simply, abandonment to God's will, self-surrender. I give up, Lord. I accept. I offer it to you. As the antiphon from the Office of Readings, Tuesday, week 2 says, surrender to God, and he will do everything for you. Very beautiful. Surrender to God, and he will do everything for you. So let's ask Our Lady then for the grace to allow the Lord to purify us so that we can become more and more like her, more and more like our Lord, so that we can welcome them more with a loving heart at Christmas time. Praise be Jesus and Mary, now and forever.